Welcome to Mr. Geronimo, where every story has a dark side. We arrived at the Appalachian trailhead just before dawn broke across the ridgeline. The six of us had planned this trip for months, discussing every detail during those long winter nights when retirement felt closer and our bodies felt younger than they truly were. Dennis Ortiz pulled the van into the parking area, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel with the ease of someone who had driven these mountain roads for 4 decades. Behind him sat Gloria Gomez, checking her backpack for the third time, her reading glasses still perched on her nose from the map study she had completed the night before. In the second row, Raymond Murray adjusted his hearing aids while Jerry Wells cracked his knuckles, eager to start moving. Kelly Freeman gazed out at the towering pines that surrounded us, their peaks disappearing into the morning mist. Janice Webb was already outside, stretching her aging legs against the van's bumper, refusing to acknowledge that her 67 years might slow her down. We were all seasoned hikers who had walked these trails before, though never as a unified group, and never for 7 straight days of backpacking deep into the wilderness. The forecast had promised clear skies and mild temperatures. The season was late August, when the heat of summer begins to soften in the high elevations. We checked our equipment one final time. Water purification tablets in every pack, first aid kits secured to belt loops, satellite communicators charging in Jerry's backpack, and enough freeze-dried meals to sustain us through a week of continuous movement. Dennis read the trail regulations aloud, his voice steady and authoritative. No camping within 200 yards of water sources. No fires above 4,000 feet. Report any unusual wildlife to the ranger station immediately. We all nodded in acknowledgement. The first 2 days were uneventful. We made good time through the established trails, following the blue blazes painted on trees that marked the official path through the Appalachian wilderness. Our lungs burned as we climbed elevation changes that seemed to grow steeper with each passing year of our lives. By the second evening, we had established a rhythm. Dennis and Jerry managed the communal stove, while Gloria and Kelly prepared the meals. Janice and Raymond maintained the tents and organized our supplies. Conversation flowed easily. We shared stories about our children and grandchildren, about the jobs we had left behind, about the reasons each of us felt called to spend a week suffering in the mountains rather than relaxing at home. On the third morning, Raymond was the first to mention something odd. He had heard sounds during the night, he said. Not the sounds of animals we had trained ourselves to expect. Not raccoons or deer or the occasional black bear moving through the underbrush. These sounds were different. They came from somewhere high above our campsite, echoing down through the canopy in a pattern that almost sounded deliberate. Almost sounded like communication. We dismissed his concerns with the patience we reserved for elderly relatives. Raymond sometimes struggled to distinguish between the natural soundtrack of the wilderness and the products of his imagination. Jerry suggested it was likely an owl. Gloria pointed out that owls made distinctive calls, and Raymond probably had simply not recognized the species. We finished our breakfast and packed up to continue. By late morning on the third day, we had moved considerably higher into the mountains. The elevation gain was beginning to show in our legs. Even Dennis, who prided himself on his physical condition, moved with less fluidity than he had the day before. The trail wound through a section of forest that was notably older than the areas we had previously traversed. The trees here were enormous, their trunks so thick that 3 of us holding hands could not have wrapped our arms around them. The canopy above was so dense that even at midday the forest floor remained in perpetual gloom. What little light penetrated came in thin shafts that illuminated the mist moving through the trees like something alive. We stopped to rest near a ridge outcrop that offered views of the valleys below. Gloria distributed energy bars, and Kelly rationed the water with careful attention to our remaining supplies. That was when Jerry first heard it clearly. He stood abruptly, placing one hand on Dennis's shoulder and holding up the other for silence. From somewhere in the forest above us came a sound that none of us could immediately identify. It was not quite a call and not quite a cry. It was something that seemed to occupy a strange middle ground, as if a human voice was being forced through an animal's vocal apparatus against all natural laws. The sound ended with an abrupt stopping, as if whoever or whatever produced it had simply turned off communication mid-sentence. Raymond's face went pale. He said he recognized it now. He said he had heard this sound before on one of his early morning walks in these very mountains more than 40 years ago. He said locals called it the day hoot. though he did not understand why something that called during daylight would carry the word Hoot in its name. None of us wanted to believe that what he was suggesting was real. The day Hoot was folklore, the kind of story told to children to keep them from wandering too far from home. It was not a creature that actually existed. It could not be. Yet the sound came again, closer this time, and it carried with it a quality of intelligence that no animal call we recognized could possess. Dennis made the decision to move down the trail rather than set up camp as we had originally planned. He said we needed to reach the shelter station 12 miles downslope, that the elevation was too high for us to safely camp in the approaching evening, that moving would give us better security and access to resources. We accepted his reasoning without argument, though each of us understood that his real motivation was to escape whatever was making those sounds. We moved quickly, almost running in some sections where the trail allowed it. Behind us, the forest seemed to press closer. The afternoon light began to fade much earlier than we expected, as if the canopy above had somehow grown thicker as we walked beneath it. The day Hoot called again, this time from behind us and to the left. Jerry swore and increased his pace. Janice, despite her age, kept up with the group without complaint, though her breathing became labored. Raymond kept repeating that he had been right, that this was not folklore, that the stories his grandmother told him were actually true accounts of a creature that still walked these mountains. Gloria tried to reason with him, but her voice sounded thin and uncertain in the growing shadows. We did not reach the shelter station that night. We reached it 3 hours after true darkness had fallen, guided only by our flashlights and the faint blue blazes on the trees that seemed to glow with an eerie intensity in the beam of our lights. The shelter was a 3-sided wooden structure with a concrete floor and a roof that had seen better decades. It offered protection, but it offered no walls on one side, leaving us exposed to whatever might approach from the direction of the mountain. We built no fire, though regulations would have permitted one at this elevation. We gathered close together on the concrete floor, our sleeping bags arranged in a tight circle so that no one was isolated. Jerry kept his hands on his knife. Dennis held his flashlight like it was a weapon. Kelly and Gloria sat close together, their shoulders touching. Janice and Raymond wrapped their arms around each other like siblings united against a common threat. None of us slept that night. The silence that came with true darkness was somehow worse than the sounds that had accompanied us down the trail. We sat listening to the forest, waiting for any indication of movement or proximity. Around 3 in the morning, the day Hoot called again. It came from multiple directions simultaneously, as if there were several of them surrounding our shelter, communicating with each other in a language constructed from human tones that had been twisted into something alien. Raymond whimpered softly, repeating words in Spanish that I recognized as prayers. Kelly started crying, though she tried to muffle the sound against Gloria's shoulder. Dennis stood and walked to the edge of the shelter, shining his flashlight into the absolute blackness beyond, but finding nothing. The light seemed to be swallowed by the darkness as soon as it left the beam's source. Whatever was out there, it stayed beyond our ability to perceive it visually. Just before dawn, Jerry said something had moved past the open end of the shelter. He said he saw a shape, tall and impossibly thin, moving through the trees with a movement that was not quite like any animal he had ever witnessed. He said it seemed to be walking on 2 legs, but in a fashion that suggested those legs bent in directions that legs should not bend. He said it turned to look at the shelter, and though its head was too far away to make out features, he felt something akin to the sensation of being observed with intense intelligence and profound hunger. None of us wanted to believe him, but we all saw the way his hand shook. We all saw the genuine terror in his eyes. When the sun finally rose, we could see nothing in the forest that would explain what we had heard, or what Jerry claimed to have seen. The area around the shelter was just forest, trees and undergrowth, and the ordinary debris of a functioning ecosystem. No tracks, no evidence of any large animal, no damage to the structure. By daylight, the whole experience seemed dreamlike. Dennis suggested that the stress of the hike and the strangeness of Raymond's initial report had simply made us suggestible. That what Jerry had seen was likely nothing more than a shadow cast by an animal that his frightened mind had interpreted as something sinister. Jerry did not agree, and from his expression, neither did Raymond. Kelly wanted to leave immediately. She proposed that we simply hike out, abandon the remaining 4 days of our expedition, and return to civilization where we belonged. Dennis vetoed the idea. He said that we had paid for this trip with both money and significant physical effort. He said that turning back based on sounds and shadows would mean admitting that we were not capable of handling a week in the wilderness. He said that there were only 4 more days before we reached the exit point, and we had already made it through the most difficult section. We should continue. We continued. We moved down the trail with our water bottles refilled from a mountain stream. Our spirits buoyed slightly by the presence of daylight, but our trust in the forest's safety permanently compromised. The landscape began to change as we descended. The enormous old-growth trees became less frequent. Younger pines and hardwoods took their place. The gloom that had characterized the higher elevations began to lift. We made good time, reaching a second shelter by early afternoon. This one was larger and had been recently maintained, suggesting that rangers visited this area regularly. We decided to camp here and push for the exit point over the next 3 days, rather than exploring any of the side trails we had originally planned. No one objected. That night we heard the day hoot again, but it was distant, higher up on the mountain, as if whatever was making the sound had remained at the higher elevations rather than following us downslope. We took some comfort in this, though we still posted a watch rotation, with one person remaining awake at all times, sitting at the edge of the shelter with a flashlight and a knife. I took the second watch, sitting in the quiet hours between midnight and 3 in the morning, watching the forest and trying to convince myself that what we had experienced was explicable, that there was a rational basis for everything we had encountered. But sitting there in the darkness, listening to the wind move through the trees, I found it increasingly difficult to maintain that conviction. There were sounds in the forest that did not fit into any category of animal behavior I understood. There were calls that seemed to follow patterns too structured to be instinctive. There were moments when I felt the distinct sensation of being studied by something intelligent, something that was keeping pace with our group despite our best efforts to move forward and escape. On the 5th day, something changed. We had descended significantly, and the forest around us had become almost ordinary. We could see other hiking groups in the distance. We could hear human voices for the first time in days. We seemed to be approaching civilization and safety. Dennis was visibly relieved. Jerry had finally stopped scanning the canopy above constantly. The tension that had characterized the group since the first night at the high-elevation shelter had begun to ease. Janice even mentioned that she was looking forward to a hot shower and a real meal prepared in a kitchen rather than rehydrated in a camping stove. That was when Raymond fell. He was walking between Kelly and Gloria, following the trail down a steep section of mountain, when he suddenly stumbled. He went down hard, his backpack shifting forward on his shoulders and throwing off his balance completely. He tumbled down the slope, his body bouncing off rocks and scraping against trees, before coming to rest in a ravine approximately 40 feet below the trail. We heard the impact. We heard his cry of pain cut short by the force of his landing. We climbed down after him, moving as quickly as we could manage without repeating his accident. When we reached him, he was conscious but badly injured. His left leg was bent at an angle that indicated a fracture. His right arm was scraped and bleeding. His ribs would later be revealed to contain at least 3 fractures, but he was alive. Dennis immediately radioed for help on our satellite communicator. He reported our location and requested emergency evacuation. The coordinates went through without difficulty. The response came back that a helicopter would be dispatched, but weather conditions and available resources meant we could expect approximately 4 hours before extraction. We would need to stabilize Raymond and keep him comfortable until then. While Dennis attended to Raymond with a first aid proficiency that suggested he had received medical training at some point in his career, Jerry and I began the process of creating a wider area around the injured man, clearing brush and fallen branches to provide space for a helicopter landing. It was while we were working on this task that I saw the first sign that something was very wrong. High above us, in the canopy of the towering evergreen trees that covered this section of slope, something moved. It was not moving with the random motion of wind-blown branches. It was moving with purpose, maintaining a position approximately above our location despite our presence and activity below. When I looked up, I thought I could see a shape among the branches, dark and impossibly still despite the motion of the wind around it. The shape seemed to be watching us. I said nothing about what I had seen. I did not want to cause panic while we were in the middle of managing Raymond's medical crisis. Jerry, however, noticed my upward gaze and followed my line of sight. He saw the shape too, or at least he saw something that made him grab my arm with a grip tight enough to bruise. He pulled me closer and whispered that whatever that was, it was not an animal. He said it was standing upright. He said it had a head and shoulders that were too human to be anything else, but the proportions were all wrong. He said its arms were too long. He said it was perfectly camouflaged against the dark trunks and shadows of the evergreens. He said it was watching Raymond. Before Jerry could say anything more, the day Hoot called out from the canopy above. This time there was no distance to the sound. It was immediate and overwhelming, the full force of that impossible vocalization bearing down on us from what could only be 30 or 40 feet away. It was a sound that seemed to resonate in my chest, that made my teeth ache, that brought every instinct in my body to screaming attention. The shape in the canopy moved, and suddenly it was no longer hidden against the tree trunks. Suddenly I could see it clearly, and my mind struggled to process what I was perceiving. The creature was tall, perhaps 8 or 9 feet, and it was covered in hair that seemed to shift between gray and brown and a color for which I had no name. Its face was nearly human, with eyes that were large and dark and possessed an intelligence that was both chilling and unmistakable. Its mouth was open, revealing teeth that were too long and arranged in patterns that suggested dietary specialization in flesh. Its arms hung below its waist, ending in hands that had too many joints. Its legs were jointed in reverse directions compared to any animal I knew. It was holding itself in the branches with a grip that suggested strength far beyond what any human could achieve, and it was looking directly down at Raymond. Dennis screamed and covered Raymond's body with his own, pulling the injured man close and trying to shield him from whatever was in the canopy. Gloria and Kelly ran back toward the trail, their screams echoing off the canyon walls. Janice stood frozen, her mouth open but no sound emerging from her throat. Jerry drew his knife and held it before him, though what good a knife would do against a creature 20 feet away and above our heads was unclear. I found myself unable to move, rooted to the spot by a combination of primal fear and complete disbelief that what I was witnessing could be real. The creature did not attack. Instead, it opened its mouth and released another day hoot that was deafening in its proximity. The sound waves seemed to have physical force, pushing us backward and downward like we were being struck by something tangible. It was a communication, not an attack, but the effect was the same. It stopped our movement. It commanded our attention. It established dominance in a way that no amount of weapons or numbers could counter. Then, with motion that seemed to span the distance between branches in impossible ways, the creature turned and began to withdraw deeper into the forest, its form becoming gradually obscured by the undergrowth until it was nothing but a memory of what we had seen. The helicopter arrived approximately 45 minutes after we placed the call. The pilot was professional and efficient, though his expression suggested that our story about a large animal in the area was being mentally filed under the heading of traumatized hikers seeing things. Raymond was extracted carefully, his injuries attended to by trained personnel as he was lifted into the aircraft. Dennis requested that we all be extracted as well, that he was ending the expedition immediately. The pilot agreed, and within an hour, all 6 of us were in the helicopter, leaving the Appalachian wilderness below us. We did not speak during the flight. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, our own attempts to rationalize what we had seen and experienced. The investigation that followed was thorough but ultimately inconclusive. Park rangers searched the area where Raymond had fallen and where we had encountered the creature. They found nothing, no tracks in the soil, no hair caught on branches, no scat or other biological evidence of any animal that matched our description. They suggested that the combination of stress, physical exertion, and proximity to a genuine emergency had created conditions for mass hallucination. Psychologists term it shared delusion, or folia 6, occurring when extreme circumstances allow a group to collectively misinterpret sensory information. We were examined by wilderness medicine specialists and cleared for release. Official report filed with the State Park Service indicated no evidence of wildlife that posed a threat to the hiking community. It recommended no changes to trail access or camping locations. It suggested that we might want to consider less strenuous recreational activities in the future, given our ages and the apparent impact that this experience had caused to our psychological well-being. But we all knew what we had seen. Raymond, recovering in a hospital bed from surgeries to set his fractured bones, drew a picture on a tablet using a stylus in his right hand, the only limb with sufficient mobility to allow him to accomplish the task. The drawing was crude but unmistakable. It showed the creature, proportioned correctly, with all the details that we had observed during those terrifying moments at the ravine. He drew it with eyes that saw things too clearly, with hands that shook slightly as he worked. He saved it to his tablet and shared it in a group message to all 5 of us. No one had requested it. No one needed to see the drawing to remember what had occurred. But Raymond needed to document it. He needed to create a record that we all possessed, a shared proof that what we had experienced was real, regardless of what official investigations concluded. Gloria stopped hiking entirely after the expedition. She took up gardening instead, spending her time in cultivated spaces with carefully managed plants and no wild canopy above her head. She became nervous in situations where she could not see clearly around her, in parking garages and dense indoor public spaces. She sought therapy and reported improvement, though I suspected the improvement was superficial, a performance for the benefit of her therapist and her family rather than a genuine healing. Kelly went the opposite direction. She became obsessed with research, spending countless hours on the internet accessing obscure forums dedicated to cryptid sightings and folklore. She contacted researchers who spent their careers investigating reports of unknown animals in the Appalachian region. She told them everything, provided them with our group's account, and offered herself as a primary witness for any investigations they might be conducting. Most ignored her. A few took her seriously enough to conduct interviews. Nothing came of it. The creature remained unidentified, its existence unconfirmed by the scientific community. Jerry became hypervigilant in ways that damaged his relationships. He installed security cameras at his home and monitored them obsessively. He would not camp or hike. He avoided forests entirely, even wooded city parks, citing anxiety that he could not control. His family eventually convinced him to seek psychiatric treatment. He was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder and began a course of medications and cognitive behavioral therapy. The treatments helped marginally, but the underlying fear never fully left him. He had seen something that his mind could not process or accept, and that gap between perception and belief created a fissure in his psychological stability that he spent the remainder of his life trying to bridge. Janice simply refused to speak about the incident. If anyone brought it up in her presence, she would leave the room or end the conversation abruptly. She began having health problems within months of our return, high blood pressure, and persistent insomnia that seemed to age her more rapidly than the preceding years had. She would die 18 months later from a stroke, and I have always wondered if the stress of our experience in the mountains contributed to her early death. Dennis tried to maintain normalcy for everyone. He organized a meeting between all of us 6 months after the expedition. We gathered at a restaurant in a city far from the Appalachian region. We attempted to have a normal conversation about other topics. We deliberately avoided mention of what had happened on the trail, but none of us could fully relax. None of us could pretend that our group had not been fundamentally changed by our encounter with the creature that the old folklore called Hoot. By the end of the meal, we had all tacitly agreed that we would not meet as a group again. The connection between us had been forged in fear and strangeness, and there was no way to transform it into a connection rooted in anything positive. We parted ways that evening and have barely maintained contact in the years since. As for myself, I have spent considerable time attempting to understand what occurred during those 7 days in the Appalachian wilderness. I have read everything I can find about cryptids and folklore creatures native to the region. I have studied accounts from centuries past of beings that indigenous populations encountered in these forests, creatures that existed at the margins of their territories and inspired stories meant to keep people from wandering too far into areas where human civilization had no reach. The Hoot appears in some of these stories, though it is called by different names in different accounts. Some traditions describe it as a guardian creature that protects the oldest parts of the forest. Others portray it as something older and stranger, a being that evolved in these mountains before humans arrived and has learned to coexist by maintaining distance from our settlements. A few accounts suggest that the creature actively hunts humans, particularly those who venture into its domain during certain seasons when hunger or other biological imperatives drive it to predatory behavior. I do not know which of these interpretations is correct. I do not know if we saw what we thought we saw, or if Jerry and Raymond's initial observations combined with our collective anxiety to create something in our minds that was more creature than reality. I do know that every single person in that group experienced something that changed them fundamentally. I know that our encounter with the wilderness that week revealed aspects of the world that do not fit into the comfortable frameworks of understanding that modern society provides. I know that there are places in these mountains where human understanding has limited reach, where forces and entities operate according to rules that we do not comprehend. I know that despite decades passing since that expedition, I still experience a complex mixture of dread and fascination when I recall those 7 days. The memory is particularly vivid in late summer, when the season mirrors the timing of our expedition. I sometimes find myself thinking about those old-growth forests, about the enormous trees and the gloom that never fully cleared even during midday. I think about the day Hoot and the impossible way that its vocalization seemed to reach into the depths of my being and trigger responses older than consciousness itself. I think about what might have happened if Raymond had not fallen, if our encounter with the creature had occurred in different circumstances, on different terrain, with different outcomes available to it. I think about whether that creature is still in those mountains, still roaming the forests above 8,000 feet, still utilizing its strange vocalizations to communicate with its own kind or to establish dominance over the areas it inhabits. There are times, particularly on quiet nights when the wind sounds a certain way in the trees near my home, that I hear something that reminds me of the day Hoot. It is never precisely the same sound. It is never close enough to inspire genuine concern. But it triggers the same response that the original sound created, a sense that something ancient and intelligent is attempting to communicate across the distance between civilization and wildness, between the known and the unknowable. I have stopped trying to rationalize these moments as coincidence or misidentification. I have accepted that what we encountered in the Appalachian wilderness exists in a category of experience that cannot be fully explained by science or reason. And I have made a decision that I suspect each of my 5 companions made independently of the others. I will never return to those mountains. I will never hike those trails or camp in those shelters or allow myself to venture once again into the domain of the day Hoot. The wilderness holds many wonders, but it also holds mysteries that humans were not meant to investigate too closely. Some things are better left undisturbed in their ancient territories. Some creatures are better left alone in the gloom where they have dwelt since before memory. Some experiences are better forgotten, though I know that no amount of time will allow me to truly forget what we saw in that ravine, what we heard from the canopy above, what we glimpsed of a world that exists just beyond the margins of our understanding. If you are listening to this account, if you find yourself drawn to the Appalachian forests and considering an expedition into the high elevation trails where the old-growth trees still stand, I would urge you to reconsider. I would ask you to remember our experience. I would warn you that the wilderness has guardians, and some of those guardians do not welcome the intrusion of humans into their territories. The day Hoot is waiting in those forests, in the gloom beneath the enormous pines, in the shadows where daylight cannot fully penetrate. It has been waiting for centuries. It will continue waiting long after every human who reads this account has turned to dust. And if you venture into its domain, it will know that you are there. It will watch you. It will study you. And whether it chooses to harm you or simply frighten you depends on factors that we are not equipped to comprehend. May you never hear its call from anywhere closer than the realm of nightmares. That summer started like any other vacation would have started for our group. We had been planning this expedition into the Appalachian wilderness for nearly 8 months. Adam Simpson called us all together on a Saturday morning in June and laid out the detailed itinerary for our camping and hiking venture along the remote sections of the Appalachian rivers. I remember standing in his home office and looking at the maps he had spread across the table. The red lines marked our intended route through valleys and along riverbanks that seemed endless on paper. Beverly Stevens had packed supplies with military precision the night before, checking and rechecking every item 3 times. She was 60 years old and tougher than most people half her age. Nathan Tucker, the oldest among us at 71, had insisted on joining despite concerns from his family. He said he wanted to see the old country one more time before age took that opportunity away completely. Heather Porter arrived early on that first morning in her truck, and Douglas Hunter followed shortly after in his SUV. Alice Hicks was the last to arrive, carrying nothing but a small backpack and a thermos of hot coffee. We assembled at the meeting point near the ranger station, and I stood there watching my companions, never imagining what the next week would bring. We loaded the vehicles with tents and sleeping bags and food supplies that filled the cargo areas completely. Adam had printed out maps and highlighted certain sections in yellow. He explained the hiking routes, estimated distances between camps, and the best places to find fresh water from the river. Nathan nodded along, occasionally asking questions about elevation changes and water depth. Beverly checked her GPS device and backup compass multiple times, testing both to ensure they functioned properly. Douglas kept reviewing the weather forecast on his phone, frowning at predictions of thunderstorms by midweek. Alice simply smiled and said she was ready for whatever came. The drive took us 3 hours into the mountains. We passed through small towns with names I could barely pronounce, places where the buildings looked like they had been standing since the previous century. The landscape became wilder as we drove further. Trees grew denser. The roads became narrower and more winding. Eventually we reached the parking area near the river access point where our real journey would begin. We parked the vehicles and checked everything one final time. Adam distributed the GPS trackers and satellite messengers. He made us all promise to stay together as a group and to report back to someone every evening through the devices. The Appalachian rivers in this region were known for their beauty and their isolation. Civilization felt very far away already. Heather began setting up the first camp while Beverly organized the food supplies in bear-proof containers. Douglas checked the tent stakes and tested the waterproof seals on our gear. Nathan sat on a large rock and studied the river, watching the current move past us. Alice helped me gather firewood from the dry branches scattered throughout the forest floor. As the sun began its descent, we sat around the fire and ate dinner. Adam told stories about previous camping trips he had taken years ago. Beverly shared information about local history and the Native American tribes that had lived in this region for centuries. Nathan offered warnings about wildlife we might encounter, emphasizing that we should make noise while hiking to avoid surprising any bears or mountain lions. Heather and Douglas discussed the photography opportunities, planning shots of sunrise and sunset from different vantage points. Alice rarely spoke, but when she did, her words carried weight and understanding. That first night felt completely peaceful. The fire crackled and popped. The river flowed beyond our camp with a constant, soothing sound. Stars filled the sky in numbers that seem impossible compared to anywhere in the city. I fell asleep listening to the wind in the trees and feeling grateful for this escape from ordinary life. The second day arrived clear and bright. Adam woke us all at 6 in the morning. We ate breakfast quickly and prepared our day packs for the first major hike. He had planned a route that would take us along the river for about 8 miles, following a trail that wound through valleys and crossed several tributaries. The path started easily enough. Beverly led the way, her steady pace setting a good rhythm for the entire group. Nathan followed close behind her, and Heather stayed near him, ready to help if the elevation changes bothered his knees. Douglas walked with his camera out, stopping frequently to capture images of the landscape. Adam took the middle of our formation. Alice and I brought up the rear, walking together and talking quietly. The forest around us was thick and alive. Plants grew everywhere, and the canopy above filtered the sunlight into green-tinged beams that illuminated the path. Birds called from the branches, and occasionally we would hear the rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. After about 2 hours of hiking, we reached a clearing that overlooked a wide section of the river. We stopped there to rest and drink water. Beverly pulled out a map and confirmed our position with the GPS device. She announced we had covered nearly 3 miles and were right on schedule. Adam suggested we could continue to the next camp by late afternoon if we maintained this pace. Everything seemed perfect. The adventure was unfolding exactly as planned. Nathan sat on a boulder and dangled his feet toward the water. Douglas was photographing the landscape from multiple angles. Heather was examining wildflowers growing at the clearing edge. Alice and I were drinking water and eating energy bars. Beverly was checking supplies and making notes in her logbook. I remember Adam pointing out a route that led down to the riverbank. He wanted to fill our water bottles directly from the river so we could test the filtration system he had brought. Beverly hesitated. She studied the ground leading down to the water and seemed uncertain. Looking back now, I think Beverly sensed something was wrong, but she said nothing. Adam began walking down the slope toward the river, and one by one we followed him. The ground became increasingly muddy as we descended. Our boots sank into soft earth with each step. The smell of mud and decomposing vegetation became strong, almost overwhelming. Alice commented that the area seemed different from the rest of the forest, damper and more stagnant somehow. Nathan agreed with her, noting that the trees in this section seemed older and more twisted than the ones we had passed earlier. Douglas was still taking photographs, entirely focused on his work. Heather had stopped talking and was watching the water carefully. We reached the muddy bank where the river flowed past us. Adam knelt and began filling the first water bottle. The mud beneath his feet was unusually thick and dark, almost black in color. Beverly remained standing several feet away from the water's edge, still studying the landscape. I stood next to Douglas, who had finally lowered his camera and was staring at something in the water about 30 feet downstream. At first I could not see anything unusual. The river was moving steadily, murky green colored from the sediment it carried. Then I saw it too. Something large was moving in the water. At first I thought it might be a log or debris floating downriver, but the way it moved suggested something was propelling it beneath the surface. The shape was wrong for any animal I had ever seen before. It was too long and too thick to be a fish or beaver. The water displaced around it seemed too dramatic. Alice saw it next. She made a small sound in her throat and moved closer to Beverly. Nathan had noticed something was wrong from our reactions and turned to look. He saw the disturbance in the water and his face went pale. Douglas finally lowered his camera and looked at the thing he had been photographing unknowingly. Heather gasped and pulled her arm through Beverly's arm. Adam was still kneeling by the water. He turned his head slowly to look at what held our collective attention. The thing in the water moved closer to the bank where we stood. The water became shallower where it was heading, and I began to see more detail. There were ridges along the top of whatever it was, like a curved spine or shell. The color was a muddy brown that matched the water so perfectly that sometimes it seemed to disappear entirely into the river itself. Then part of it broke the surface. We all saw it clearly for a fraction of a second before it sank again. It looked almost like a head, but wrong in every possible way. The proportions were inhuman. The shape was asymmetrical. Where an eye might have been, there was a hollow depression that seemed impossibly deep. Beverly moved quickly. She grabbed Adam by the shoulder and pulled him away from the water. She said his name sharply, and he stumbled backward, dropping the water bottle. Nathan was already backing up the slope, his movements careful but desperate. Heather was hyperventilating, and Douglas had the camera held tight against his chest. Alice was already moving toward higher ground, and I followed her. We did not run. Something about the presence of that thing kept us from running. Running felt wrong, felt like it might trigger an attack. We simply moved steadily backward and upward, keeping our eyes on the water. Beverly maintained her grip on Adam. Douglas and Heather stayed close together. Nathan was moving the fastest, his earlier complaints about his knees completely forgotten. The thing in the water followed us. It paced alongside our movement, staying just offshore, never moving too quickly, but never losing sight of us either. I could see more of it now. The head was enormous, easily 3 feet across. The body extended behind it in a serpentine fashion, but thicker, more muscular than any snake could be. The skin looked like it was covered in mud and algae and things I could not identify even from a distance. Its eyes, those terrible hollow eyes, watched every move we made. We reached the top of the slope and regrouped on the trail. We were all breathing heavily. Nathan was shaking visibly. Heather was crying softly. Douglas had the camera out again, but his hands were trembling so badly he could barely hold it. Alice was checking on Beverly. Adam was stunned, unable to process what we had witnessed. I remember Beverly's voice cutting through the silence. She asked if everyone had seen it. We all confirmed that we had. Adam wanted to know what it was. None of us had an answer. Beverly suggested we continue along the trail back to where we had established our camp. She wanted to gather everything and move to a different location immediately. Nathan agreed with her. He said he wanted to be anywhere but in this valley. Douglas asked if we should call for help using the satellite messenger. Adam considered this. He said we had not been attacked. We had only observed an unusual animal. He was not sure what help would look like or if anyone would take our claim seriously. Beverly nodded slowly. She said we should move camp first. We could consider our options once we were in a safer location. The walk back seemed to take much longer than the walk out had taken. We moved faster than before, and the conversation was minimal. We simply wanted to put distance between ourselves and that thing we had seen in the water. Every time we crossed a stream or came within sight of flowing water, we tensed. Every shadow seemed potentially threatening. What had appeared as a beautiful wilderness adventure in the morning had transformed into something darker and more sinister by afternoon. When we reached our first camp, we worked in coordinated efficiency. Beverly directed the breakdown of tents and collection of supplies. Douglas began securing everything into the bear-proof containers. Heather helped gather the scattered items. Nathan was checking the GPS device, looking for a location that would be far from the river. Adam was sitting on a log, still processing what we had seen. Alice was the first to mention the name. She said it quietly, almost as if she was afraid of summoning something by speaking the word aloud. She said the word mud bottoms. Nathan looked at her sharply. He asked her how she knew that name. Alice said she had read about it years ago. She had encountered references in old folklore collections and historical accounts from the region. She described it as something that lived in the deepest parts of the Appalachian waterways, something that had been reported in various forms throughout centuries of settlement in these mountains. Beverly interrupted and said we could discuss this later. Right now, we needed to move. We loaded our supplies and abandoned the first camp. Beverly consulted with Adam about the location Nathan had found on the GPS. It was inland, several miles away from the main river channel, near a smaller tributary that was shallower and more exposed. We agreed that location would be better than staying near the river. The hike to the new camp took us through dense forest. The elevation increased significantly as we climbed away from the river valley. Our pace was steady but grueling, weighed down by all our supplies and the emotional exhaustion from what we had experienced. By the time we reached the new location, the sun was low on the horizon. We set up camp with military precision. Beverly supervised the placement of every tent. Douglas ensured we had good sight lines around our perimeter. Heather and Nathan gathered firewood quickly and efficiently. Adam was quiet, sitting by the fire as it grew larger. Alice and I worked together to prepare a simple dinner. No one had much appetite, but Beverly insisted we eat. She said we needed to maintain our strength. After dinner, we sat around the fire in near silence. Douglas eventually asked the question we were all thinking. He wanted to know if that thing would follow us. Beverly said it was unlikely. She noted the creature had seemed tied to the river, specifically the muddy, deep sections. Our new camp was inland and elevated. We should be safer here. Nathan asked Alice to tell us what she knew. Alice hesitated. She said she did not know much, only fragments from old stories and historical references. The mud bottoms was a creature of the Appalachian region, something that had been mentioned in various forms in Cherokee and frontier folklore. Some accounts described it as a guardian spirit of the river. Other accounts described it as a predatory creature that dragged unwary travelers into the water. The descriptions varied, but the core element remained consistent. It was old, intelligent, and territorial. Beverly asked if Alice had any idea how to protect ourselves. Alice said the old stories mentioned a few things. Most emphasized avoiding the water and not camping directly on the riverbank. Some accounts mentioned that the creature did not travel far from water sources. A few references suggested that certain rituals or protective measures existed, but Alice admitted she did not remember the specific details. Adam said we should assume the creature was territorial and would not follow us far from its river. We would maintain distance from all major water sources for the remainder of our trip. We would reassess our situation in the morning with fresh perspective. Heather suggested we consider cutting the trip short and hiking out to civilization. Nathan agreed with her. He said there was no shame in abandoning the expedition given what we had experienced. But Douglas and Adam argued for staying. Douglas said we had come here to experience the wilderness, and we should not let fear drive us away. Adam added that we had supplies for a week, and it would take us 2 days minimum to hike back to the vehicles. He suggested we proceed cautiously, but continue as planned. Beverly broke the tie. She said we would stay, but with significant modifications to our itinerary. We would avoid the main river channel entirely. We would stick to the tributary streams and inland hiking paths. We would assign watch duties throughout the night, with 2 people awake at all times. We would not venture near any body of water without full group consensus. Everyone agreed to Beverly's conditions. We organized the watch schedule. Adam would take the first watch with Beverly. Douglas and Heather would take the second watch. Nathan and Alice would take the final watch. I volunteered to take an additional position, helping whoever was on watch. We settled into our tents with a level of anxiety that made sleep seem impossible. Yet exhaustion eventually claimed us. I drifted off sometime after midnight, listening to Beverly and Adam talking quietly by the dying fire. The second night passed without incident. When morning came, we all felt slightly more secure in our new camp location. The forest around us was thick and normal-looking. The tributary nearby was small and shallow, completely unlike the deep, dark sections of the main river where we had seen the creature. Adam suggested we take a short hiking expedition to a ridgetop that promised excellent views of the surrounding valleys. Beverly approved the plan. She insisted we move as a group and maintain constant communication. We prepared our day packs with water and energy bars and the satellite messenger. The hike to the ridge took about 90 minutes. The trail was steep and challenging but rewarding. From the top, we could see for miles in every direction. The Appalachian landscape rolled out beneath us in waves of green forest with rivers and streams threading through the valleys like silver threads. Douglas spent an hour photographing the landscape. Heather and Nathan sat on a rocky outcropping, discussing the geological formations and the geological history of the region. Beverly and Adam studied the maps and oriented themselves to the landscape below. Alice and I stood together, looking out toward the section of river where we had seen the creature. It seemed impossible that something so unknown, so wrong, could exist in this beautiful landscape. Alice spoke quietly. She said she had researched the mud bottoms more thoroughly in her mind during the night. She had remembered additional details from the folklore accounts she had read. Alice explained that the creature was supposedly ancient, perhaps dating back thousands of years, predating human settlement in Appalachia. Some accounts suggested it was not truly an animal, but something else, something that had adapted to the river environment over centuries. The old stories mentioned that the mud bottoms was territorial but also curious. It would watch humans, study them, understand them. Some of the more detailed accounts spoke of instances where the creature had displayed intelligence that went beyond mere animal instinct. Alice said these accounts described the mud bottoms as hunting with strategy and patience. It would wait for opportunities. It understood risk and benefit. In some stories, it had shown preference for certain types of prey and deliberate avoidance of others. I asked Alice if she was suggesting the thing we had seen was actively hunting us. She said she did not know. She said the creature had certainly noticed our presence. Whether that notice constituted a threat remained unclear. I felt a chill run through me, despite the warm sun. We hiked back to camp by mid-afternoon. Everyone was tired but in better spirits. The sense of being in a beautiful place was returning, tempering but not erasing the fear we had experienced. Beverly prepared a meal while Douglas organized his photographs on his camera. Heather and Nathan played cards while sitting near the fire. Adam was writing in a journal, documenting what we had experienced. Alice was reading a small book she had carried in her backpack, something about mythology and folklore. I was assigned the task of checking and organizing all the supplies. The evening passed peacefully. The conversation was lighter, more normal. We talked about our lives outside this expedition, about work and family, and plans for future vacations. It felt almost normal until we turned in for the night. That was when we began hearing the sounds. At first I thought it was an animal moving through the forest. The sound was a strange vocalizing, something between a grunt and a whistle. It came from somewhere beyond the edge of our camp, out in the darkness beyond our firelight. Beverly heard it too. She stopped speaking mid-sentence and held up her hand for silence. We all listened. The sound came again, closer this time. It was not any animal sound I recognized. It had an intentional quality to it, almost like it was calling for something. Douglas grabbed his camera and pointed it toward the sound. The screen illuminated in the darkness. Before he could take a photograph, Beverly told him to put it away. She said the flash might startle the animal. But we all knew it was not an animal. Heather moved closer to Adam. Nathan's hand went to the knife he carried on his belt. Alice was watching the darkness with an intensity that suggested she had expected this. The sound came a third time, and now it was accompanied by movement. We could hear brush breaking and branches cracking as something large moved through the forest beyond our camp perimeter. Beverly stood and began organizing items near the fire. She gathered pieces of deadwood and stacked them at the edge of our encampment. She told everyone to move back from the tents and gather at the center of camp. We did as she instructed, without question. The presence of the creature was suddenly undeniable, no longer something we could rationalize away as an unusual animal. It was out there in the darkness, circling our camp. The vocalizations continued at regular intervals. Sometimes it sounded closer. Sometimes it seemed to move to a different side of our perimeter. It was testing us, I realized. It was learning the boundaries of our camp and the positions where we had placed our tents. The hours passed in agonizing slowness. We maintained a vigil around the fire, which Beverly had allowed to burn brighter than usual. The light seemed to keep the thing at a distance, though it never truly left. We could hear it at the edge of visibility, moving through the darkness, vocalizing intermittently. Nathan was gripping his knife so tightly his hand was shaking. Heather had pressed herself against Adam. Douglas was sitting very still, his camera pointing toward the darkness. Alice looked almost unsurprised, as if she had anticipated this development. Beverly was watching everything with calm calculation, noting the sounds and the patterns of movement. Adam was pale and shaken. I felt fear more acute than anything I had experienced before. Around 3 in the morning, the sounds stopped abruptly. The creature simply ceased its vocalizations and its movement, and the forest became silent and still. We waited an hour to make sure it was truly gone before anyone attempted sleep. When dawn arrived, we immediately packed and prepared to leave. Beverly announced we were cutting the expedition short by 5 days. She said we would hike back to the vehicles today. Adam did not argue. None of us argued. We had come to the Appalachian wilderness to experience nature, not to encounter something like this. The hike out would take most of the day if we maintained a steady pace. We could be at the vehicles by early evening. Beverly supervised the breakdown of camp with absolute efficiency. Everything was packed and organized within 2 hours. We prepared to leave, taking one last look at the camp that had felt relatively safe before the creature's nocturnal visit. The return hike took us through different terrain than we had used to arrive. Beverly deliberately chose paths that led us away from all major water sources. We moved quickly, driven by fear and the desire to reach civilization. The day was hot and exhausting. We stopped minimally for rest and water. We ate energy bars while walking. Douglas did not take photographs. Heather kept close to Adam. Nathan moved with surprising speed for his age. Alice walked with Beverly, the two of them occasionally speaking in low voices. I stayed near the rear of the group, constantly turning to check if we were being followed. Around mid-afternoon, we reached a section of the trail that seemed different from the rest. The terrain opened into a larger clearing where the path widened significantly. We were making good time, and I felt a growing sense of relief that we might actually make it to safety. Then Beverly suddenly held up her hand and stopped. The entire group halted behind her. She was staring down at the trail ahead of us. At first I could not see what had alarmed her. Then she pointed to the ground. The mud and soft earth of the trail showed a trail of impressions leading across the path, massive and deep depressions that looked like something enormous had crawled across recently. The impressions were so fresh that water was still seeping into them. Beverly consulted her map with trembling fingers. She noted that a river tributary ran along the northern side of the clearing, about 500 feet from where we stood. The creature had crossed the trail here, moving from that tributary toward some other water source. It had passed directly through the clearing where we now stood, probably within the last hour. Douglas looked like he might become ill. Heather was shaking. Nathan gripped his knife again. Adam was staring at the impressions as if he might memorize their exact dimensions. Alice knelt down and examined the marks more closely. She stood up slowly and said the creature had been moving with purpose, not randomly. The depth and spacing of the impressions suggested it was traveling steadily toward something or away from something. Beverly decided we should leave the trail entirely. She would navigate us cross-country, staying on high ground and avoiding any path where water might be flowing. This was riskier in terms of navigation, but it would put us on an unpredictable route, making us harder to track. We left the established trail and began moving through the forest, climbing elevation and moving generally toward the location of the parking area. Progress became slower and more difficult. We had to navigate around dense vegetation and rocky areas. Several times, Beverly had to stop and consult her GPS device to confirm our position. Night was beginning to fall by the time we reached a ridge that allowed us to see toward the valley where the parking area should be. We had made good progress, and Beverly announced that we could reach the vehicles within another 3 hours if we carefully descended the slope that led down to the access road. We would stop briefly on the ridge to eat some food and prepare for the final push. We settled down on the ridge and opened our remaining food supplies. No one was particularly hungry, but Beverly insisted again that we needed energy to complete the journey. As we ate, the conversation was minimal. We were all focused on reaching safety. Douglas kept checking his camera to see how much battery remained. Heather was examining a blister that had formed on her heel. Nathan was stretching his legs. Adam was staring toward the parking area we could see in the distance below. Alice was quiet, sitting apart from the group, watching the forest around us. I was performing a safety check on all our supplies, making sure nothing had been lost or damaged. By 7 in the evening, we began the descent toward the access road. The slope was steep and rocky, requiring careful footing. Beverly led the way, her sure steps and calm demeanor giving us confidence. Douglas followed, then Heather and Adam together, then Nathan. Alice came next, and I followed behind her. We were tired and ready for this ordeal to end. The parking area was visible below us, and our vehicles looked exactly as we had left them 3 days ago. Just a few hundred yards and several dozen steep steps separated us from safety. That was when we heard the sound. It was not the strange vocalizing we had heard the night before. This was something different. It was a roar, or a bellow, a sound so deep and powerful that it vibrated through the ground beneath our feet. It came from somewhere to our left, from the direction of the river that ran down the valley beside the access road. The sound was not echoing from a single point. It seemed to be coming from multiple locations, or the creature was moving and vocalizing as it traveled. Beverly told us to move faster. We accelerated our descent, no longer being careful about our footing, just trying to reach the vehicles as quickly as possible. Branches whipped at our faces and scraped our arms. Rocks turned under our feet, threatening to break ankles, but we did not slow down. Behind us, the sounds continued. The creature was definitely moving, and it was definitely moving in the same direction we were moving. It was hurting us. The realization struck me with sudden clarity. The creature was not attacking us or trying to cut off our escape. It was pushing us, encouraging us to continue moving toward the parking area and the vehicles. Alice had turned and shouted this observation to Beverly. Beverly nodded as if she had already understood. She said the creature was intelligent enough to understand that we were leaving its territory. It was ensuring we actually left rather than trying to circle back for some reason. This was a form of escort, albeit a terrifying one. We reached the parking area at nearly 8 in the evening. We had been hiking almost continuously for 14 hours. We were exhausted beyond measure. But the creature's vocalizations had ceased once we had reached the vehicle location. As we fumbled with keys and doors, there was no sound from the forest behind us. The thing had released us from its territory. It had accomplished whatever its goal was in allowing us to leave alive. We got the vehicle started and immediately drove away from the parking area. No one spoke for several miles. We simply wanted to put distance between ourselves and that place. Eventually, Beverly pulled her vehicle to the side of the road and looked at all of us. She asked if we all understood what we had experienced. We nodded slowly. Nathan said he thought we had been allowed to live because we had shown respect for the creature by not attacking it and by leaving its territory when confronted. Alice agreed. She said the folklore accounts had mentioned that the creature was intelligent and preferred to avoid conflict if the humans were willing to leave peacefully. Heather asked what would have happened if we had tried to fight, or if we had refused to leave. No one answered because none of us wanted to imagine that scenario. We drove through the night to get back to civilization. By morning, we were in a populated area, surrounded by highways and towns and the noise of human activity. We sat in a diner drinking coffee and eating breakfast, looking at each other like we had survived something that no one else would believe. Douglas had the photographs he had taken. He reviewed them carefully, printing out the clearest images of the river section where we had seen the creature and the impressions it had left on the trail. But the photographs did not capture what we had experienced. They were just images of water and mud and forest. The fear and the intelligence and the intentionality of the creature's actions were not recorded by any camera. We parted ways that morning, exchanging contact information and promising to stay in touch. But the truth was that we all wanted to put this experience behind us. We wanted to return to our normal lives and pretend that the Appalachian expedition had not happened. Yet the events of those 3 days remained with me constantly. I found myself researching the mud bottoms compulsively, reading every account and every reference I could locate online or in library archives. The more I read, the more I understood how fortunate we had been. The creature was documented in various forms throughout Appalachian folklore and historical records. The earliest accounts dated back centuries, to the era of initial European settlement in the region. Native Americans had apparently known about the creature and had established protocols for interaction with it. Protocols that involved respecting its territorial claims and never hunting it or threatening it directly. As settlement expanded into Appalachia, people seemed to encounter the creature with increasing frequency. The accounts varied in details but remained consistent in the core elements. The creature was massive, aquatic or semi-aquatic, highly intelligent, and strictly territorial. It seemed to prefer isolation and wanted nothing to do with humans. However, when humans invaded its territory, the creature would respond with calculated precision. Some accounts suggested it would attack if provoked, or if it perceived humans as a threat to its food sources or its breeding grounds. Other accounts, fewer in number, suggested that the creature might spare humans if they demonstrated appropriate fear and deference and a willingness to leave the territory. This last category of accounts matched our experience exactly. I began communicating regularly with Alice through email. She had continued her research more systematically than I had. She discovered historical records of various military expeditions and hunting parties that had entered the Appalachian wilderness with the intention of exterminating what locals called mud bottoms, or other regional names for the creature. The historical accounts of these expeditions were uniformly grim. Most ended with the hunting party retreating, often with serious casualties. A few expeditions simply disappeared entirely, with no survivors returning to describe what had happened. Alice found one particularly detailed account from the 1920s, where a group of sportsmen had hired a professional hunter and tracking guide to help them locate and kill a large creature that had allegedly been attacking livestock in a particular valley. The expedition had departed confidently and well armed. The survivor who returned, just barely alive and severely traumatized, reported that the creature had methodically hunted and killed the entire expedition. It had attacked at night, separating members of the group and eliminating them one by one. The survivor had escaped only because the creature had seemingly lost interest in pursuing him, focusing instead on one of the other hunters. By this time, I had decided to share our experiences with Alice, Douglas, and Heather in detail. I met with them separately, recording their accounts of the expedition and our encounter with the creature. Adam and Nathan and Beverly had all requested that we not contact them about this matter anymore. They wanted to forget. I understood their desire, but I felt compelled to understand what we had experienced. Douglas had developed a fascination with the creature that bordered on obsession. He had spent considerable money hiring someone to analyze the photographs he had taken of the creature and the impressions it had left. The analysis suggested the creature was approximately 30 feet long, based on the spacing of its limbs and the distance between the impressions. The head, as we had observed, was enormous, roughly 3 to 4 feet in length. The musculature suggested it was incredibly strong, far more powerful than any known river predator. Heather had experienced nightmares related to the expedition for weeks. She eventually sought help from a therapist, but she could not explain the root of her anxiety without sounding completely insane. The therapist attributed her distress to general wilderness anxiety and prescribed anti-anxiety medication. Heather stopped attending therapy after a few sessions because she felt the treatment was not addressing the real cause of her fear. I had started planning another trip to the Appalachian region, not a camping or hiking expedition, but a research mission. I wanted to go back with proper equipment to conduct research on the mud bottoms. I wanted to photograph it more clearly, maybe even film video evidence that could document its existence. Alice strongly discouraged this plan. She said the creature had let us leave in peace. That was a gift we should not squander by returning. She explained that the creature had demonstrated tolerance for our presence as long as we were leaving its territory. If we returned with cameras and research equipment, we would be entering its domain deliberately and with clear intent to study it. That crossed a line. The creature would likely react very differently. Alice mentioned one of the historical accounts she had found that described an encounter between a group of university researchers and the creature. The researchers had come with measurement equipment and the intention to prove the creature's existence scientifically. The creature had destroyed their equipment, destroyed their camps, and killed several of the researchers. Only the ones who abandoned their research and fled had survived. I reluctantly accepted Alice's reasoning. I acknowledged that the smart thing was to leave the creature alone and encourage others to do the same. Yet the desire to go back remained. Something about that encounter had changed me fundamentally. I could not stop thinking about how the creature had moved with such intelligence and purpose. I could not stop wondering about its inner life and its understanding of the world around it. It was not a mindless beast. It was a conscious being, adapted perfectly to its environment, asking only to be left alone. I began writing more detailed accounts of our expedition and our encounter with the creature. I worked to make these accounts scientific and objective, free from emotional language or exaggeration. I wanted to create a definitive record of what had happened, something that could be referenced if others encountered the creature. 6 months after our expedition, I received an email from Nathan. He had apparently broken his agreement with himself to move on from this experience. His message was brief and disturbing. He explained that he had been researching the mud bottoms as well, attempting to understand what we had encountered. He had located some extremely old accounts, including written descriptions from a time period before formal scientific taxonomy existed. These early accounts described the creature in ways that seemed impossible. They suggested the creature was not merely intelligent, but potentially possessed consciousness and culture comparable to humans. Some very old accounts suggested the creature had language and had used that language to communicate with humans in the distant past. This last claim seemed absurd, but Nathan had found corroborating evidence in multiple independent historical sources. Multiple accounts describe situations where the creature had made sounds that seemed to convey specific meanings. Some accounts suggested the creature had deliberately spared humans who had shown respect and deference. Other accounts suggested the creature had conducted something analogous to trials or judgment when humans had behaved badly in its territory. Whether these accounts described literal language or something more subtle remained unclear. But the consistency of the descriptions across centuries and across different cultural sources seemed significant. Nathan's email ended with a warning. He wrote that our encounter with the creature had been unusually brief and nonviolent. He wondered if the creature had specifically chosen to let us leave because it perceived something in our group that it valued or respected. He suggested that the creature might be more interested in humans than the folklore accounts suggested. He recommended that I be extremely cautious about returning to Appalachian wilderness areas. He wrote that the creature seemed capable of far more than simply hunting or territorial defense. He implied that the creature might have goals and intentions that extended beyond mere survival. I found his email both fascinating and deeply unsettling. It suggested a possibility I had tried not to think about. What if the creature had allowed us to leave not simply because we were willing to leave, but because it wanted us to leave? What if it had a reason for choosing to spare us specifically? The thought haunted me. A year passed. Life returned to some semblance of normalcy. I had returned to my job and my regular routines, but the expedition never truly left me. I thought about it constantly, researched it compulsively, and wondered what it meant. Then, one morning, I received a package. There was no return address. Inside was a map of the Appalachian Rivers region, the same region where our expedition had taken place. Several locations were marked in red. A handwritten note accompanied the map. The handwriting was old and shaky. The note read, "To the ones who listened and left in peace. The valleys remember your courtesy. If you wish to truly understand, return to these places. Come alone or bring those you trust completely. Come prepared to learn, not to hunt or exploit. The creature that dwells in these waters offers knowledge to those wise enough to receive it. Do not share this with those who might bring weapons or greed." The invitation was extraordinary and terrifying. I spent weeks deciding what to do. Every rational part of me screamed that this was insane, that returning would be foolish, that the promise of knowledge was not worth the risk. Yet something deeper than reason pulled at me. I wanted to understand the creature. I wanted to know if there was truly intelligence there, truly consciousness. I wanted to know what it had been trying to communicate through its actions and its restraint. I showed the map to Alice. She was very quiet for a long time after examining it. Finally, she said she believed the note was genuine. She said she had read accounts of similar invitations in the oldest folklore records. She said the creature had apparently offered itself to humans it considered worthy, offering knowledge and understanding in exchange for protection and respect. She asked me if I planned to accept the invitation. I told her I did not know. I said that part of me wanted to ignore it and pretend it had never arrived, but another part of me felt that the expedition and this entire year of research had been preparing me for this possibility. Alice said I should go, but I should go carefully. She offered to provide me with every piece of information she had gathered about the mud bottoms and how to interact with the creature safely. She also offered to give me written instructions for specific rituals of respect that had been mentioned in the oldest accounts. I accepted her offer. Over the next month I prepared. I gathered research materials and documentation. I reviewed everything Alice had provided. I thought about what I might discover and what it might mean. I considered the possibility that I was walking toward danger or toward the greatest discovery of my life, perhaps both. The night before I was scheduled to depart, I received one final email. It was from Douglas. He wrote that he had been following my research over the past year, that he had kept in touch with Alice, that he wanted to join me on the return trip. He admitted that he had also received a package similar to mine, with a map and an invitation. He had been debating whether to tell me, worried that involving multiple people might be more dangerous than going alone. But he had decided that if we were going to do this, we should do it together. Strength in numbers, he wrote, even if we were only two. Heather also wanted to come, he explained. She had not received an invitation, but she wanted to face her fear directly. She wanted to understand what had happened and why. Douglas asked if I was willing to have both of them accompany me. I agreed. I said we would meet and prepare together. The three of us met 2 weeks later. We gathered everything we needed for a week-long expedition. We reviewed Alice's research and recommendations. We discussed what we might encounter and how we should respond. By this time, I was certain that we were not walking toward death. I had begun to believe that we were walking toward something transformative, something that would fundamentally change our understanding of what was possible in the world. We drove into Appalachia again in late spring. The landscape was green and alive and beautiful, just as I remembered it. We reached the parking area where our previous expedition had begun almost exactly 2 years prior. We parked the vehicles in the same spot where they had sat before our encounter with the creature. As we prepared to hike, I felt both terror and anticipation. I did not know what we would find or what we would learn, but I knew that we had to try. The creature had extended an invitation. We had been chosen for some reason. I intended to discover what that reason was and what the creature actually was beyond the legends and the folklore. I picked up my backpack and checked my supplies one final time. Douglas was doing the same. Heather was looking at the map, studying the locations that had been marked for us. The three of us began walking toward the forest, toward the river, toward whatever waited for us in that ancient and mysterious wilderness. This was not the end of our story. It was perhaps the beginning of something much larger, something that went far beyond a simple camping trip or an encounter with an unknown creature. As we entered the forest, I turned back one last time to look at the parking area. Then I turned again toward the path ahead and walked forward into the growing shadows. The Appalachian wilderness had called to me twice. I answered that call again, knowing that this time I would finally learn the truth about the mud bottoms and what it wanted from us. The forest grew darker as we moved deeper into the valley. The sounds of civilization faded behind us, and in the distance we could hear the roar of the river, calling us toward whatever mysteries awaited. I remember the morning we left like it was yesterday, even though every single day since then has felt like a year wrapped inside a nightmare that never ends. It was June 23rd when our group drove out to Appalachian waters for what we thought would be a peaceful summer getaway. Peter Crawford had organized everything with his usual precision. He was the kind of man who made lists for his lists, the type who checked his gear twice and then checked it again just to be absolutely certain. I admired that about him, even though his obsessive nature could wear on people after a while. Nicole Henry kept joking about how we were going to disconnect from the world and find ourselves. She talked about meditation and clean air and the healing power of nature as we loaded the vehicles. Harold Boyd, his face weathered like the mountains we were about to enter, just sat quietly and smoked his cigar. He did not say much about anything anymore. At 75 years old, he had earned his silence, I suppose. Samantha Mason was excited in that nervous way she had, talking too much and laughing at her own comments. Carl Morales kept checking his phone, even though he knew we would not have signal where we were going. Rose Kennedy stood apart from the group, her arms crossed, watching the sunrise over the parking lot like she was seeing something the rest of us could not perceive. The drive took 8 hours. We traveled northeast through winding roads that grew narrower and more remote with each passing mile. The landscape transformed gradually from civilized suburban neighborhoods into thick forests and rolling hills. By the time we reached our base camp near the waters, the last traces of cell service had vanished completely. We were alone in the way that only people in the deep wilderness can be alone. Peter pointed out landmarks on his worn topographical map. He showed us the hiking trails we would traverse, the fishing spots he had researched, the camping locations he had deemed safe and secure. Everything appeared to be perfectly planned. Our camp was situated on a clearing near a bend in the water where the current ran swift and dark. Harold suggested we should have camped farther back from the shore, but Peter overruled him. The bank was gentle there, and the water access would be excellent for fishing in the early mornings. We set up our tents in a semicircle around the central fire pit. By sunset, everything was arranged with military precision. Rose started preparing dinner on the portable camp stove, while the rest of us gathered wood for the evening fire. The forest seemed to close in around us as the light faded. The trees grew taller and denser the farther you looked into the gloom. That first night was peaceful. We sat around the fire telling stories and drinking coffee. Nicole talked about her job at the marketing firm and how stressed she had become. Samantha mentioned her teenage daughter and how they never talked anymore. Peter discussed the routes we would hike over the coming days. Harold smoked another cigar and occasionally added a comment about how things used to be better in the old days. Carl and Rose mostly listened. There was a comfort in the normalcy of it all. I felt the tension leaving my shoulders for the first time in months. The woods were quiet except for the occasional animal sound and the rush of water in the distance. Around midnight, Peter suggested we turn in early so we could start our first hike at dawn. We retreated to our tents, and I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the forest breathe around me. Small creatures moved through the underbrush. The wind rustled through the canopy above. These were normal sounds, the regular nocturnal symphony of a wilderness area. I felt safe enough to drift toward sleep. It was Harold who woke me with a shout around 3 in the morning. I unzipped my tent quickly and emerged into the cold darkness. Everyone was coming out of their tents, confused and alarmed. A smell had swept through the camp, something rancid and wrong, like decay mixed with something acidic that burned the inside of your nose. Peter had his flashlight out, scanning the perimeter. Harold was pointing toward the water. Something had come up onto our beach while we slept. The sand was disturbed in ways that suggested something large had moved across it. There were marks like nothing I had ever seen, deep impressions that looked almost like footprints, but not quite right. They were too wide, and the spacing was wrong. The claws or whatever had made them had dug deep into the earth. We stood in the darkness staring at these marks for what felt like an eternity. Carl suggested maybe it was a bear, even though none of us believed that. Rose pointed out that bears did not leave marks like those. Harold said nothing, but his jaw was set tight, and he kept looking out at the water, like he was expecting something to emerge from those dark depths. Nicole wrapped her arms around herself and asked if we should break camp and leave. Peter said we were not going to be chased away from our vacation by some animal we could not even identify. He suggested maybe it was a wild boar or a large deer that had ventured too close to camp, looking for food scraps. We had been careful to store all our food properly, but animals could smell provisions from incredible distances. Despite Peter's reassurances, nobody wanted to go back to sleep. We sat around a hastily relit fire, waiting for sunrise, trying to convince ourselves that we were being foolish and paranoid. Rose made a fresh pot of coffee while the night slowly surrendered to the approach of dawn. Samantha's hands shook as she held her cup. Nicole kept checking her dead phone as if cell service might magically return. Carl kept his eyes on the water, watching and waiting. Harold sat absolutely still, smoking his cigar, and I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. Peter tried to maintain his cheerful demeanor, but even he seemed shaken by what we had discovered. When the sun finally rose over the eastern hills, we examined the marks more carefully in the light. They extended from the water all the way up the bank to within just a few feet of our camp perimeter. Whatever had made them had moved with purpose and direction, following what appeared to be a deliberate path. The tracks were at least 7 or 8 inches wide. The depth suggested something very heavy had pressed down into the earth as it walked. We followed them with our eyes toward the forest, but they disappeared into the dense vegetation. Peter called a group meeting after breakfast. He suggested that we continue with our planned activities, but exercise greater caution. We would hike in pairs, always carrying the air horn he had brought as a safety precaution, and we would return to camp well before sunset. Harold disagreed strongly. He said we needed to leave immediately and that he would not be responsible for what happened if we stayed. Peter argued that abandoning our vacation over footprints from an unknown animal would be cowardly. Samantha sided with Harold, but Nicole and Carl were less certain. Rose said nothing, but the expression on her face suggested she agreed with the older man. I was conflicted. Everything in my instinct screamed to listen to Harold, but I also did not want to be the one who suggested we run away in fear. In the end, Peter won through sheer force of his personality. We decided to stay, but we would follow his safety protocols carefully. The hike was scheduled to begin at 10 in the morning. We would take the Eastern Trail, a moderate 5-mile loop that was supposed to offer excellent views of the valley below. Peter and Nicole would go together. Harold and Samantha would hike as a pair. That left Carl, Rose, and myself to form the third group. The morning seemed to stretch forever as we prepared. Everyone moved slowly, reluctant. The discovery of those tracks had drained something essential from our excitement. By 9:30, we were ready. Peter did a final equipment check and distributed the air horns. He emphasized that if anyone felt uncomfortable or heard anything suspicious, we should sound the horn immediately and regroup. The forest was beautiful in ways that made me ache. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shafts. The air smelled of pine and earth and something green that suggested life in its most abundant form. We walked along a narrow trail that had been maintained by hikers over many years. The path wound through dense vegetation, ascending gradually as we moved deeper into the wilderness. Rose walked ahead of us while Carl and I followed behind. None of us talked much. There was something about being in the forest that made unnecessary conversation feel disrespectful. After about an hour, we encountered Peter's group heading back toward us. Nicole looked pale. Peter was trying to maintain his confidence, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. He said they had heard something strange about half a mile up the trail and had decided to turn around and return to camp. Nicole elaborated that it was a sound, something between a roar and a wet snarl that did not sound like any animal they had ever heard. She described it as almost intelligent, like it was trying to communicate something. Peter quickly downplayed this interpretation, suggesting it was probably a cougar or some other large predator, and that we should all return to camp immediately. We did not need to be told twice. We retraced our steps quickly, and as we walked, I became acutely aware of how quickly the beautiful forest could transform into something claustrophobic. The trees seemed closer together on the way back. The shadows seemed deeper. Every snapping twig and rustling leaf made me tense. By the time we reached the camp, we were all moving at nearly a jog. Harold and Samantha were already back. Harold sat cleaning his knife on the steps of his tent. Samantha looked terrified. She had been crying and her face was blotchy. Before anyone could ask what had happened, she burst into a description of what they had seen. They had been hiking for perhaps 30 minutes when Samantha had stopped to take a photograph. Harold had continued a bit farther ahead. When she caught up to him, he was standing frozen in the middle of the trail, staring down at something in the dirt. It was a deer, recently dead. The body was still warm according to Harold, but the way it had been killed was wrong. There was no bite wound, no claw marks that made sense. The animal appeared to have been crushed. Its rib cage was flattened, compressed as if something with immense strength had simply gripped it and squeezed the life out of it. The legs were bent at angles that seemed geometrically impossible. Harold said it had only been dead for a few hours at most. That meant whatever had killed it was still in the area, possibly nearby. Samantha said that as she stared at the dead deer, she heard a sound from deeper in the forest. She described it as a low growl, but with something underneath it, something that sounded almost like words being spoken in a language she did not understand. The sound had paralyzed her with fear. Harold grabbed her hand and they ran back toward camp without looking behind them. Peter said we needed to think rationally about this situation. A large predator like a cougar or perhaps a bear had killed the deer. The sound was probably just the animal calling or vocalizing. None of this suggested that we were in any immediate danger if we stayed alert and took reasonable precautions. But even as he said these things, I could see doubt flickering across his face. Rose walked to the edge of camp and stood looking out at the forest. She did not say anything, but her body language spoke volumes. That afternoon, we barely left the camp. We stayed close to the fire pit, keeping busy with small tasks that did not really need doing. We cleaned the camp, organized gear, checked and rechecked the food storage. Anything to keep our minds engaged and our bodies close to the perceived safety of our group. Darkness fell early, or perhaps it just felt that way because we were all so acutely aware of it approaching. We prepared dinner in silence. The venison that Peter had brought was somehow inappropriate now. Nobody wanted to eat meat. Rose made a vegetable stew instead. As night descended completely, a fog began to roll in from the water. It moved slowly and deliberately, like something alive and conscious. Within an hour, the camp was wrapped in mist so thick that you could barely see 20 feet in any direction. The fog seemed to muffle sound and change the entire character of our surroundings. The water that had been a gentle background presence now sounded ominous. Every splash and ripple seemed magnified by the mist into something sinister. Around 9 in the evening, we heard it. The sound that Samantha had described reached us clearly across the water and through the fog. It was a roar, yes, but underneath it was something else, something that suggested consciousness and intelligence. The sound rose and fell in patterns that seemed almost like speech. It was the single most unsettling thing I had ever heard. Nicole started to cry. Samantha was trembling. Even Peter looked shaken. Rose remained still, just listening, her expression unreadable. Harold said we should prepare to leave immediately. He said we needed to pack only essentials and prepare to drive away at first light. Peter resisted. He said panicking would not help anything, and that running would only encourage whatever was out there if it was predatory. He reminded us that animals generally avoided humans. Our sheer numbers and our fire should be enough to deter any normal predator. But this did not feel like a normal predator. Everyone could sense that. The night became a study in fear. We sat around the fire, which we kept burning bright, talking in low voices or sometimes not talking at all. Every sound from the forest made us jump. Twice we heard splashing from the water that suggested something large was moving in the shallows. Once, around 2 in the morning, something that sounded almost like breathing came from the edge of the fog that surrounded our camp. We all froze, listening. It continued for perhaps 30 seconds, a deep rhythmic sound that suggested something massive respiring in the darkness just beyond the reach of our firelight. Then it stopped as suddenly as it had begun. I did not sleep that night. None of us did. We sat in a tight cluster around the fire, some of us dozing occasionally but never really resting, always ready to react to any threat. Carl kept his hand on a heavy flashlight that he used as a weapon. Rose held a long piece of firewood in her lap. Samantha never stopped shaking. Harold remained watchful and alert, smoking cigarettes this time instead of his cigars. Nicole had retreated into herself, her arms wrapped around her body in a gesture of self-protection. Peter maintained his posture of authority, but even he could not completely hide his fear. Toward the end of the night, as dawn was just beginning to hint at the eastern horizon, something emerged from the fog near the water. I saw it only for a moment before it retreated back into the mist. But what I saw was burned into my mind with perfect clarity. It was enormous, at least 8 feet tall, moving with a gait that was not quite right for any four-legged creature. Its silhouette suggested something with too many joints, limbs that bent in ways that should have been impossible. The skin or fur was mottled and seemed to shimmer even in the dim light. And the head, I only caught a glimpse of it, but the head seemed too large for the body, with what looked like multiple protrusions, or perhaps horns extending from its skull. When I tried to describe what I had seen to the others, I could barely form the words. They stared at me with expressions ranging from shock to disbelief to absolute terror. Peter said I had probably just seen the fog creating an optical illusion, that shadows and mist could play tricks on the mind, especially when you were exhausted and frightened. But Rose was nodding slowly. She said she had seen it too, just at the edge of her vision as she was staring into the fire. Harold said nothing, but he lit another cigarette and his hands were not steady. We left camp at dawn. Peter abandoned his usual methodical approach, and we threw things into bags with no real organization. The tents were left standing, the fire still smoking from the night before. We drove out of Appalachian waters like we were fleeing from something, because we were. Nobody spoke during the drive back to civilization. The road seemed longer than they had been on the way in, every mile stretching and expanding. It was only after we reached the nearest town and stopped at a diner for coffee that anyone tried to speak about what we had experienced. Peter was still trying to convince everyone that it was a natural animal we did not recognize, something rare but ultimately explicable. Harold was having none of it. He finally told us a story that he said his grandfather had told him many years ago, a story he had dismissed as folklore and exaggeration until now. His grandfather had been a guide in these mountains during the 1930s. He had spoken of a creature that moved through Appalachian waters and the surrounding forest, a thing that was not quite animal and not quite anything else. The locals had called it Fangmalia. According to the stories, it was an ancient thing, something that had lived in these mountains long before humans came. It was intelligent in its own way, predatory, and absolutely deadly. The stories said that occasionally it would emerge from the deep places where it dwelt and hunt. During those times, entire hunting parties would go missing. Livestock would be found dead in ways that made no sense. Some of the killings seemed almost like they were intended to send a message. The creature was supposedly large and grotesque, with a physiology that seemed designed for something other than this world. The stories said that those who survived encounters with it reported that its vocalization sounded almost like language, like it was trying to communicate something, but in a way that human minds could barely process. Harold said that his grandfather had warned him never to camp near the waters in summer, when the creature seemed most active. He had forgotten that warning over the decades, had dismissed it as an old man's superstition. When Harold finished speaking, nobody contradicted him. We had all felt something in that forest that did not belong to the natural world as we understood it. We had all seen or heard things that defied easy explanations. Samantha asked what the creature wanted from us. Harold said he did not know. His grandfather had speculated that it was territorial, that it was trying to drive human intruders away from its domain. Or perhaps it was simply hungry in ways that had nothing to do with normal predation. Peter tried to suggest that we should report what we had experienced to the relevant authorities, but Carl immediately pointed out that nobody would believe us. We would sound insane. The authorities would write it off as bears and mountain lions and the natural dangers of wilderness camping. They might even open an investigation, and we would end up having to explain ourselves to skeptical officials who would ultimately conclude that we had panicked in the dark and misidentified normal forest sounds and shadows. Nicole said that she kept thinking about the tracks at the camp, the way they seemed to follow a deliberate path, the way they came up from the water and stopped just short of our tents. It felt like the creature had been investigating us, assessing us perhaps, deciding whether we were worth attacking or just threatening. The fact that it had not attacked suggested either that it was not as aggressive as the folklore implied, or that it was playing with us somehow, prolonging the experience for reasons we could not fathom. Rose finally spoke after being silent through most of the drive and the diner conversation. She said that she had grown up in these mountains, that her family had stories passed down through generations about things that lived in the deep forest and the dark waters. She had always assumed they were metaphorical or exaggerated, ways of teaching children to respect the wilderness and fear the places where humans did not belong. But she had never quite dismissed them entirely. There was always that small part of her that believed, just a little bit, that something else lived in those mountains. Seeing it, or at least seeing something that matched the descriptions from the old stories, had confirmed a suspicion she had carried her entire life. Samantha said she wanted to call the police anyway, just to make an official report. Samantha wanted to warn other people about the danger. Rose gently explained that they could not prove anything and that the authorities would be more likely to recommend psychological evaluation than launch an investigation into a cryptid in Appalachian waters. The best thing we could do was warn people we knew to avoid the area during the summer months, particularly the region near the waters. The conversation shifted to practical matters after that. We exchanged contact information and made a pact not to discuss what had happened with anyone outside our group. We agreed that if any of us ever encountered other people who claimed to have seen something strange in Appalachian waters, we would validate their experiences and warn them about Fang Malaya by name. We would be guardians of this knowledge that nobody else would believe. As the days passed and we returned to our normal lives, the experience began to take on a dreamlike quality. Normal reality reasserted itself with its demands and distractions. Work and family and routine consumed our attention, but none of us ever forgot. I know I certainly did not. There were nights when I would lie awake, thinking about what I had seen emerging from the fog. I would think about what might have happened if we had stayed one more night. I would think about that intelligence behind the vocalizations, that sense that the creature was trying to communicate something we were just barely not equipped to understand. I returned to research the folklore of the region, anything I could find about creatures like the one we had encountered. I found references scattered through old newspaper archives and historical documents. In 1892, an entire logging crew disappeared from Appalachian waters. No bodies were ever found, but the company abandoned the site immediately and refused to disclose why. In 1917, a group of fishermen reported a creature in the waters that they described as large enough to create whirlpools. Most of them disappeared within the week. Their boats were found empty on the shore. The one survivor refused to speak about what had happened and was committed to an institution where he died 3 years later. The pattern repeated across the centuries. Indigenous people had accounts of a thing that lived in the waters and hunted the surrounding lands. Early European settlers dismissed these accounts as primitive superstition. Then settlers started disappearing. Eventually, people learned to avoid that particular region, and the disappearances slowed to occasional incidents involving the foolish or the unlucky. I wonder sometimes if Fengmalia is still there, in those cold Appalachian waters and the forests surrounding them. I wonder if it has forgotten about us, or if it remembers the summer when 7 people came into its territory and then fled in terror. I wonder if it is waiting for us to come back, or if it simply exists as it always has, eternal and patient, a remnant of something ancient that predates human civilization and will persist long after we are gone. Peter eventually moved away from the region entirely. He tried to carry on with his normal life, but I heard through intermediaries that he had developed a severe anxiety disorder. Nicole's marriage fell apart, which she attributed partly to the trauma of Appalachian waters, though nobody could prove the two things were directly connected. Samantha quit her job and spent 6 months in therapy. Harold died 2 years after our experience. He had a heart attack in his sleep. I sometimes wonder if fear did that to him, if the encounter with Fangmalia was simply too much for his aged body to process. Carl and Rose stayed in touch and eventually started a support group for people who claimed to have encountered cryptids or impossible creatures. It never became large, but it provided a space for people who had experiences that nobody else would validate to find comfort in shared understanding. I joined it after several years of isolation and denial, talking to others who had similar experiences, who understood that we were not crazy or hallucinating, was helpful in ways I could not have anticipated. I have never returned to Appalachian waters. I probably never will. But I think about it constantly. I think about the fog rolling in over the camp and the silhouette of something impossible emerging from the mist. I think about those vocalizations, that almost language that suggested consciousness and intelligence and possibly a kind of malevolence. I think about being so close to something that should not exist according to everything we understand about the natural world. The worst part is the uncertainty. We do not know if what we encountered was unique to that location, or if it is still out there somewhere. We do not know if there are other creatures like Fangmelia in other remote places that people visit without realizing the danger. We do not know what it wanted from us or why it chose not to attack. We only know what we experienced and the absolute certainty that something is wrong with our understanding of the world, that there are places and things in this world that do not fit into the categories we have created to make sense of reality. Sometimes late at night when I cannot sleep, I find myself listening to the sounds of the darkness around me, waiting to hear something that does not quite belong, a sound that suggests something outside the normal parameters of existence. I have come to understand that I will never completely escape what happened in Appalachian waters. The encounter with Fangmalia has marked me in ways that are permanent and unchangeable. I carry that knowledge with me every single day. I know that something ancient and impossible exists in this world. I know because I have seen its shadow and heard its voice. I know because those things cannot be unlearned or forgotten once you have truly perceived them. Whether anyone else believes me is irrelevant. I know what I experienced. We all do. And that knowledge is both a curse and something approaching a kind of responsibility. Perhaps someday others will venture into those mountains and encounter Fangmalia as we did. Perhaps they will come away forever changed as we have been changed, and if they do, maybe they will come looking for us. Maybe they will want to know what we know, and perhaps on that day we will finally have people who understand completely what we are talking about. Until then, we remain bound by our shared experience and our shared silence, guardians of a terrible secret that nobody wants to hear. There was something deeply wrong about the way the cave mouth breathed that August morning. I noticed it the moment our group emerged from the forest trail, the opening in the mountainside like a wound in the earth itself, dark and impossibly deep. Behind me, Sean Warren was checking his equipment for the 3rd time, his 50-year-old hands fidgeting with carabiners and rope with the kind of nervous precision that only comes from having read too much online about cave safety. Judy Dixon stood closest to the entrance, her gray hair pulled back in a braid, and she was squinting into the darkness with the confidence of someone who had spent her youth exploring these Appalachian caves. Philip Ramos adjusted his headlamp, the beam cutting through the morning shadows, and I could hear his breathing, already shallow and quick despite the fact that we had not yet descended. The morning air was cool against my face, carrying the smell of damp stone and something else, something organic and faintly wrong that I could not quite identify. Megan Black was the youngest of our group, 32 years old, and she stood apart from the rest of us, filming everything with her camera for what she called her adventure blog. She had no idea, none of us did, what was waiting in the depths below. Victor Holmes was checking the group's supplies, his weathered face marked with the kind of pragmatism that comes from having worked as a surveyor for 40 years. Irene Stone stood next to him, watching the cave entrance with an expression I have never been able to properly describe. It was not fear exactly, it was something more ancient than fear. Sean gave a thumbs up to the group, his signal that we were ready to begin our descent. We had planned this trip for 6 months. All of us had been drawn to the Appalachian caves by different reasons. Judy wanted to revisit the places of her youth. Philip and Irene wanted to document the geological formations for a local university project. Megan wanted content. Victor wanted to prove something to himself, something about still being capable. Sean wanted, I think, to feel alive again after his divorce. I wanted to forget. I wanted to lose myself in something bigger than my own grief. What we all wanted, ultimately, was to descend into darkness and emerge changed. The first hour underground was exactly what we expected. The passages were wide enough for our group of 6 to move comfortably, our headlamps illuminating walls of limestone and shale that had been formed millions of years before any of us existed. Judy was pointing out different rock formations, explaining the slow work of water and time, her voice steady and educational. Philip was taking measurements, recording everything in a leather notebook that he kept in his vest pocket. Victor was mapping our route on a laminated chart, making notes with a pencil. Sean was behind me, moving carefully, testing each foothold before putting his full weight on it. Megan was still filming, her camera light adding another beam to the confusion of illumination around us. Irene walked slowly, her lips moving silently as if she was praying or reciting something from memory. The air grew colder as we descended, and the smell that I had noticed at the entrance grew stronger. It was like old meat and dust and something sweet and decaying all at once. I mentioned it to Sean, and he shrugged it off. Natural, he said. Caves smell like caves, and he was right, in a way. Caves do smell like decay because caves are where things go to die. After 2 hours of careful descent through increasingly narrow passages, we reached the main chamber. It was enormous, easily the size of a cathedral, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness beyond the reach of our headlamps. An underground stream cut through the floor of the chamber, its water black and cold and moving with a sound like breathing. This was what we had come to see. This was what had drawn us down into the earth. The chamber was beautiful in a way that was almost unbearable to witness. Judy was crying. I could see tears on her weathered face as she looked at the soaring walls above us, and I realized that she had been here before, years ago, when she was young, and she had come back to see if it still held the same power. It was then that we first heard the sound. It was not loud. It was subtle, almost beneath hearing, a kind of rustling that seemed to come from the ceiling above us. Victor looked up, his headlamp beam swinging toward the source of the sound. There was nothing visible, just darkness and stone. Judy frowned. Philip stopped writing in his notebook. Sean grabbed my arm. The sound continued, growing slightly louder, a soft whisper of movement that raised every hair on the back of my neck. Megan was still filming, her camera pointing upward, capturing the darkness. Irene had stopped moving entirely. She was completely still, her hands at her sides, and her eyes were closed. The first bat that came into view seemed almost innocent. It was large, much larger than any bat I had ever seen before, with a wingspan that must have been at least 2 feet from tip to tip. Its body was dark brown, almost black, and its wings were stretched out as it descended from the ceiling, moving with surprising grace despite its size. It was a house bat, a species that is common throughout the Appalachian region, and there was nothing inherently threatening about it. But then it was joined by another, and then another. Within moments, the air around us was filled with them, hundreds of them, thousands of them, descending from the ceiling in a wave of wings and bodies and that same rustling sound that we had heard before. This is where I need to be very careful about what I say. This is where I need to explain what I actually witnessed and not shy away from the reality of it, no matter how impossible it may sound. They did not attack us in the way you might imagine. They did not swarm over us screaming and clawing at our faces. It was far more terrible than that because it was so methodical. It was as if they were following some ancient choreography, some pattern of behavior that had been refined over thousands of generations. They seemed to know exactly where we were, even though our headlamps should have kept them away. They seemed to move around the light itself as if the light was an obstacle to be navigated rather than something to be feared. Sean was the first one to panic. His grip on my arm tightened until I thought he might break the bone, and then he was running back toward the passage we had come through, his headlamp beam bouncing wildly against the walls. The bats followed him. I know this because I watched it happen. I watched as dozens of them changed their trajectory and moved after him, their wings beating in perfect synchronization with one another. We heard him scream, we heard it echo through the chamber and down into the passage beyond. The sound of his screaming did not stop for a very long time. The rest of us did not run. I have thought about this moment many times since that day, trying to understand why we did not run, and I think the answer is that we were frozen by the sheer improbability of what was happening. Our brains refused to accept what our eyes were telling us. The bats were not attacking us, they were not even particularly interested in us. They were moving through the chamber with a kind of purposeful intention, and we were simply obstacles in their path. Victor moved first. He stepped to the side, clearing a wider space, and indicated that the rest of us should do the same. He was right, of course. He usually was. We pressed ourselves against the nearest wall, and the bats continued their descent without deviation. The stream of them seemed endless, an avalanche of wings and bodies that flowed through the chamber like water flowing downhill. The sound was deafening, a roar of biological matter in motion, and the smell grew even stronger, so thick that I could almost taste it on my tongue. Judy was whispering something, the same words over and over, so quietly that I could barely hear her. I moved closer to her and realized she was saying his name. She was saying Sean's name, over and over, as if her repetition could somehow undo what had happened to him. Her hands were shaking, and her face had gone completely white. Philip had sunk down to the ground, his notebook forgotten, his hands covering his head as if he could somehow protect himself from what was happening above him. Megan's camera had fallen to her side, no longer filming, and she was staring at nothing, her mouth open but no sound coming out. Irene was the only one of us who seemed to be thinking clearly. She grabbed my arm and pulled me toward a gap in the wall, a narrow space between two columns of limestone. Victor saw what she was doing and pulled Judy with him toward a wider opening in the opposite direction. Philip did not move. He simply sat there, his hands still covering his head, rocking slightly back and forth. The bats continued to flow through the chamber, and I realized with a horror that seemed to crack something inside my mind that they were ignoring the four of us who had found shelter. They were not interested in us at all. The reason they were not interested in us became clear as I peered out from the gap where Irene had pulled me. Sean had made it as far as the passage entrance when the bats finally caught up with him. He was not screaming anymore. He was making a sound that was far worse than screaming, a kind of high-pitched keening that sounded like it was being torn from the depths of his body against his will. The bats were covering him completely, a living blanket of wings and fur that obscured his body entirely from view. All I could see was his headlamp, still somehow on, bouncing crazily as he fell backward into the main chamber, surrounded by thousands of them. When the swarm finally lifted and moved on, what remained was something that I have never been able to adequately describe to anyone. I have tried many times. I have drunk myself into a state where the words seem to come more easily. I have lied to therapists about what I saw in that moment, editing the reality into something that seemed more believable, more survivable. The truth is that Sean was still alive for several minutes after the swarm moved away from him. He was still breathing, but the damage was so extensive, so complete, that it seemed impossible that any human body could survive what had been done to him. The bats had not just bitten him. They had opened him up, systematically, with a precision that suggested intelligence, suggesting purpose. The chamber fell silent. The last of the bats moved through the passage that led deeper into the mountain, and in the silence that followed their departure, I could hear nothing but the sound of the underground stream and the sound of Sean's final breaths, ragged and wet and wrong. The silence after the bats left was somehow worse than the terror of their presence. I do not know how long we stayed pressed against that wall. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Time had stopped meaning anything to me. Irene kept her hand on my arm, her grip steady and strong, and I was grateful for that small anchor to reality. Around us, the chamber seemed to pulse with a malevolent presence, as if the very stone walls were aware of what had happened and were drawing some kind of satisfaction from it. Victor was the one who finally spoke. His voice was low and steady, but I could hear the tremor beneath the control. He said we needed to move. He said staying where we were was not going to help anyone. He said we had to get out. Those words seemed impossible to me, but I understood the logic behind them. We could not help Sean. We could not undo what had happened. Our only choice was to move forward or move backward, and neither option seemed possible. I looked toward where Philip was still sitting, his hands still over his head, and I realized that something had changed in his posture. He had stopped rocking. His shoulders were slumped in a way that suggested surrender. When I called out to him, asking if he was all right, he did not respond. Judy made a sound that was something between a sob and a laugh, and she tried to stand up, her legs unsteady. Victor caught her before she fell. The passages back the way we had come were now blocked by something that we could not quite understand. It was not the bats. They had moved on to wherever it was that they had come from. But there was a pressure in the air, a wrongness that seemed to emanate from the entrance to the chamber. Irene squeezed my arm and nodded toward the opposite direction, toward the passages that led deeper into the mountain. She said something that I have never forgotten. She said that the bats were not going in that direction anymore, and where the bats were not was where we needed to be. This logic seemed insane to me at the time, and yet I could not think of a better alternative. We gathered what supplies we still had. Victor's map was still intact. His rope was still intact. Our headlamps were still working, though several of them were flickering as if the batteries had been drained by fear. Judy tried to speak, tried to say that we should go back, tried to insist that going deeper into the mountain was a death sentence. But her voice was too weak to carry the weight of her conviction. Victor told her that going back meant the bats, and there was nothing past the bats but darkness and the way out. Going forward meant unknown dangers, but at least it meant unknown. The passages into the deeper part of the mountain were narrower than the ones we had traversed on the way down. In some places we had to crouch, in others we had to crawl on our hands and knees, pushing our supplies ahead of us through gaps that seemed impossibly tight. Philip had recovered enough to move, though he was not really present. He moved mechanically, following Victor's instructions without seeming to understand them. I began to realize that something had broken in Philip when he was sitting alone in the chamber, exposed to the reality of what had happened to Sean, and I wondered if he was really still with us at all, or if his body was simply continuing to move through habit. Megan had not said a word since the bats had arrived. She had stopped filming, and her camera had been abandoned in the chamber. She moved through the narrow passages with a kind of grim determination, following the path that Victor had charted on his map, saying nothing. When I tried to speak to her, to check if she was doing all right, she did not respond. She simply continued forward, one hand on the wall, moving deeper into darkness. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes. In the absolute darkness of those passages, with only the beams of our headlamps to guide us, time became impossible to measure. We moved in silence, breathing in the thick, damp air that seemed to get colder with each meter we descended. Judy was coughing, her breathing becoming increasingly labored, and I began to wonder how much longer she would be able to continue. She was 64 years old, and this physical exertion on top of the psychological trauma of what we had witnessed was taking a visible toll. We reached another chamber, smaller than the first one, and Victor called a halt. We needed to rest, he said. We needed to think about what we were going to do. The chamber had a higher ceiling than most of the passages we had been traveling through, and there was no stream that we could see, though the sound of water was audible somewhere in the distance. It was colder here, cold enough that our breath was visible in the beams of our headlamps. It was in this chamber, during a rest break that has come to feel like an eternity in my memory, that Judy finally told us what she knew. She had been quiet for so long that when she started to speak, her voice seemed to come from somewhere outside the chamber itself, echoing off the walls in a way that was deeply unnerving. She said that the bats in these caves were not normal. She said that when she had been young, she had heard stories about them, stories that the local people told, stories that had come down through generations. She said that the bats in these caves had been doing this for a very long time, hunting anything that entered their domain, working together in a way that bats should not be able to work together. Victor asked her what she meant by working together. The implication of organization among animals was disturbing in a way that I did not want to examine too closely, but Judy was determined now. She was speaking with the intensity of someone who had been carrying a secret for far too long. She said that the bats did not hunt randomly. She said they targeted specific people, as if they could sense something in us that made us desirable prey. She said that she had seen it happen once before, 42 years ago, when she had been here with a group of researchers. One man had been taken. Just one. The others had escaped, but they had all kept silent about it. All agreed never to speak about what they had witnessed. Philip began to laugh. It was a terrible sound in that chamber, a laugh that was closer to a scream, a laugh that suggested that Philip's mind had finally given up any pretense of remaining intact. He laughed and laughed until he was gasping for breath, until tears were streaming down his face, until Victor grabbed him by the shoulders and shook him until the laughter stopped. When Philip's fit had passed, he was barely conscious, barely present. Victor managed to get him to drink some water from one of our bottles, and Philip swallowed automatically, his eyes blank and unfocused. I could see it happening, the slow disappearance of Philip from behind his eyes, the retreat of his consciousness into some place where it would not have to confront the reality of our situation. Irene spoke then, and it was the first time she had said anything since we had taken shelter from the bats in the main chamber. Her voice was calm and clear, and it seemed to cut through the fog of despair that had settled over our group. She said that we were thinking about this wrong. She said that the bats were not the problem. The problem was that we had come into their home, and we were not welcome there. She said that if we wanted to survive, we needed to understand how to navigate their world, not how to fight them. When Victor asked her what she meant by that, Irene pointed upward. In the beam of her headlamp, I could see that the ceiling of this chamber was covered with something. At first I thought it was just another formation of rock, but as I looked more carefully, I realized what I was seeing. The ceiling was a mass of bats, hanging upside down in their resting state, thousands upon thousands of them, their bodies clustered together so densely that you could barely see the stone beneath them. We had entered a chamber that was literally lined with them, every wall, every surface, and the entire ceiling covered in sleeping bats. The silence that followed this realization was absolute. None of us could even bring ourselves to breathe too deeply, as if we were terrified that even our breath would disturb them. Judy's hand had covered her mouth. Megan's eyes had gone wide. Victor's jaw was clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. Irene gestured for us to move, very slowly, very carefully, toward the far side of the chamber. She moved with exaggerated slowness, each step deliberate and controlled, each movement minimal. We followed her example, all of us moving like we were swimming through water, like we were afraid that the slightest disturbance would bring the entire ceiling down upon us in a hurricane of wings and teeth and hunger. It took us what felt like an hour to cross that chamber, though it could not have been more than 50 feet wide. Every second felt like it contained a lifetime. Every breath felt like it might be the one that woke them. Every small sound, every tiny movement, seemed impossibly loud in the oppressive silence. Halfway across, one of the bats stirred. Its wings shifted slightly, and I felt my heart literally stop in my chest. I froze completely, my leg half extended in mid-step, unable to move, unable to breathe, waiting for the cascade of movement that I was certain would come. The bat settled again, its wing folding back against its body, but it was awake now, its small eyes open and aware. It seemed to look directly at me, and I realized that I was looking at something with a level of intelligence that I had never encountered in any animal before. This was not the blank stare of a creature acting on instinct. This was the gaze of something that was aware of us, that was evaluating us, that was deciding whether or not we were worth the effort of waking the others. The bat's head turned slowly, following my movement as I forced my leg down and continued forward. One step, then another, then another. The bat did not move. It simply watched, its head tracking us as we continued across the chamber. When we finally reached the far wall and the passage that led away from that nightmare of a chamber, I had tears streaming down my face, though I had no memory of starting to cry. Behind us, as we entered the passage, I heard the bat's wings unfold. But it did not pursue us, it simply watched us leave, and I know, without any doubt in my mind, that it was communicating with the others. It was telling them that we were here, that we were moving through their domain, that we needed to be dealt with. The passages that led away from the bat chamber seemed to descend endlessly. Victor consulted his map, but the map had been drawn based on information that had been gathered long before anyone knew that these caves contained what Irene had called them. She had not named them outright, but I understood what she meant. These caves contained something that should not exist, something that had learned to hunt in ways that other creatures had not yet evolved to discover. Judy's condition continued to deteriorate. Her cough had developed a wet quality that was deeply disturbing, and her breathing had become more labored with each passing hour. Victor insisted that we stop periodically to allow her to rest, and Irene would sit next to her, holding her hand, speaking in low, soothing tones that seemed to comfort Judy far more than words should have been able to. Philip was becoming increasingly unstable. He would move fine for short distances and then suddenly sit down and refuse to move further. At one point, he began to speak in a language that I did not recognize, words that sounded like they came from somewhere deep in his past, from some place where language meant something different than it does to the rest of us. Megan had become something else entirely. She had shifted into a state of hyper-awareness that was almost as disturbing as Philip's dissociation. She was constantly moving, constantly checking every shadow, every corner, every possible hiding place, as if she was convinced that the bats were following us through the passages, closing in on us with each step. It was Megan who first noticed the smell changing. She said it was getting sweeter, less like decay, and more like something botanical, something that suggested life rather than death. Victor examined the walls and ceiling of the passage more carefully and realized that we were no longer in limestone. We had passed into a section of the cave system that was composed of a different kind of stone entirely. There was moisture on the walls, but it was not the stale moisture of the deeper passages. This water was moving, it was flowing. When we reached the next chamber, we realized why. The chamber opened onto a massive underground river, easily 50 feet wide, flowing with a powerful current that made a sound like distant thunder. Above the river, a natural chimney in the rock allowed pale, grayish light to filter down from somewhere far above. For the first time since we had descended into the caves, we could see something that was not illuminated by our headlamps. Victor said that the map indicated a river system that connected to the surface approximately 3 miles north of where we had entered. He said that if we could follow the river, we might be able to reach the surface and get help. The implications of his words were clear: help for Judy, help for Philip, help for all of us to escape the nightmare that these caves had become. But there was a problem. The only way to follow the river was to cross it, and the river was moving far too fast to cross safely on foot. There might be another way through the cave system, but following it meant doubling back, meant spending more time in the darkness, meant exposing ourselves to the bats again for who knew how long. It was Irene who suggested the raft. She pointed to a pile of debris that had accumulated at the edge of the river, driftwood and other materials that had been washed downstream from somewhere. She said that we could gather the wood and lash it together using the rope that Victor had brought with him. She said it was our best chance. So we set about constructing a raft, working quickly, aware that every moment we spent exposed in this partially lit chamber increased the risk that the bats would locate us again. Megan and I gathered the wood, passing it to Victor, who lashed it together with knots that seemed impossibly intricate. Judy sat watching, too weak to participate, her breathing increasingly shallow. Philip helped in a distant, mechanical way, following Victor's instructions without apparent understanding of what he was doing. Irene moved between tasks, adjusting Victor's knots, directing our efforts with quiet authority. When the raft was complete, it was a crude thing, composed of several large pieces of driftwood lashed together with multiple layers of rope. Victor tested its buoyancy by pushing it into the river, and it floated, though it rode low in the water, suggesting that we would all be soaked by the time we reached our destination. But it would float, it would carry us. As we were preparing to push off, Megan looked up at the chimney in the ceiling through which the pale light was filtering down. She said something about the light, something about it looking strange, and it was only when I followed her gaze that I understood what she meant. The light was moving. Not constantly, but periodically, in a pattern that suggested something was blocking it at intervals. The light was being blocked by something large, something that was circling the chimney opening from above. They were up there. The bats had followed us through the passages and had somehow found a way to the surface level, or perhaps they had known all along that there was a path that led to this chamber. They were circling the opening, and though they could not reach us while we were in the chamber, the message was clear. Once we ventured onto the river, once we were exposed, once we were moving toward the surface, they would be waiting. Victor stared up at the circling shapes for a long moment, and then he turned to us and said that we did not have a choice. The bats would follow us whether we stayed here or whether we took the river. At least if we took the river, we would be moving toward the surface, toward help, toward an ending to this ordeal. We loaded our supplies onto the raft and began to wade into the river. The water was shockingly cold, and the current was far stronger than it had appeared from the shore. Victor went first, pulling the raft, fighting the current, his body partially submerged. I went next, holding onto the raft, using it to steady myself against the powerful flow. Irene helped Judy into the water, supporting her weight, moving slowly. Philip followed mechanically, seemingly oblivious to the shock of the cold. Megan was the last, her eyes fixed on the chimney above, watching for any change in the pattern of light and shadow. When we were all on the raft, the current caught us immediately and pulled us downstream. Victor managed to grab one of the driftwood pieces and use it to guide us, trying to steer us toward the center of the river, away from the jagged rocks that protruded from the water along the banks. The raft moved fast, far faster than I had anticipated, the river seemingly intent on carrying us as far downstream as it could. Above us, the light from the chimney began to change. The shapes that had been circling became more distinct, and I realized with a horror that went beyond anything I had yet experienced, that the bats were beginning to descend into the chamber. They did not come in a flood, like they had in the main chamber. This time they came in waves, groups of them spiraling down through the chimney opening, their wings beating in perfect synchronization. They began to dive toward the river, toward our raft, and I realized that they intended to force us into the water, to separate us from the raft, to expose us to something in the river that I could not see. Victor was shouting something, but his voice was lost beneath the roar of wings and water. I grabbed onto a piece of the raft and held on with every ounce of strength that I possessed. The first bats struck the raft and struck hard. They seemed almost to explode on contact, their bodies absorbing the impact, their wings wrapping around anything they could find purchase on. One of them tangled in Judy's hair, and her scream seemed to wake her from a state of resignation, seemed to pull her back into the moment. She clawed at it, her fingers connecting with fur and skin and wings, and the bat shrieked, a sound that was almost humanoid in its expression of rage. More of them came, diving from the darkness above, striking the raft with increasing precision and intensity. Megan was flailing at them with one of the driftwood pieces, connecting with several and sending them flying into the water where they floated, dazed before being swept away by the current. Philip had curled up into a ball and was making no attempt to defend himself. Victor was trying to protect Judy while maintaining control of the raft, an increasingly impossible task. I remember seeing the bat that approached me clearly, every detail of it etched into my memory with a clarity that no human mind should have to retain. It was enormous, easily 3 feet from wingtip to wingtip, and its eyes held an intelligence that was almost obscene. It came at me in a straight line, its mouth open, and I could see the teeth inside, rows and rows of them, far more teeth than any animal should possess. I threw myself backward to avoid it, and my weight shifted the balance of the raft. The entire structure tilted, and for one eternal moment, it seemed like we would all be thrown into the water. But the raft held, settling back into place, and the momentum of my escape caused the large bat to overshoot and collide with Megan. The impact knocked her down, and she fell half into the water, her hands slipping from the raft, her body dragging in the current. Without thinking, without any conscious decision to do so, I grabbed her and pulled her back onto the raft. She was coughing water, gasping, and the bats were all around her, surrounding her, and I realized that they were not trying to drive her into the water. They were trying to drag her off the raft entirely. Victor made a decision that will haunt me for the rest of my life. He used the oar to push us away from Megan, to separate her from the raft, to sacrifice her so that the rest of us could continue toward what might possibly be escape. She did not scream. She simply looked at him with an expression of betrayal that seemed to cut deeper than any physical wound. And then she was gone, pulled off the raft by a dozen bats, dragged under the water, dragged into darkness. The bats broke off their attack after Megan was taken. They circled once, twice, and then they withdrew, spiraling back up into the darkness of the chamber, returning to wherever it was that they had come from. The sound of their wings faded slowly, replaced by the sound of the river, which seemed to have become even more powerful in its flow. We rode the raft downstream for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only another hour. Judy was barely conscious, her body shaking with fever. Philip had returned to complete dissociation, lying on the raft and staring at nothing. Irene sat perfectly still, her expression unreadable, her hands gripping the raft with white-knuckled intensity. Victor continued to guide us with the oar, his face a mask of grim determination. Then we saw it. Ahead of us, the river seemed to open up into light. Real light, sunlight, the light of day beyond the caves. Victor began to steer us more frantically, angling the raft, trying to move us toward what I knew must be the exit. As the raft moved toward the light, I could hear them again. The bats. They were above us, outside the cave, waiting in the daylight where we thought we would be safe. They were circling the exit, and I understood in that moment that there was no escape. There had never been any possibility of escape. The caves had wanted us, and the caves did not intend to let us leave. But then the river pulled us through. The raft shot forward, propelled by the current, and we burst out into the daylight of late afternoon. The bats descended immediately, and the last thing I remember seeing clearly was Victor standing up on the raft, the oar raised above his head, ready to fight something that could not be fought. When I came to consciousness, it was in a hospital bed. I was told that I had been found by park rangers 3 days after we entered the caves, washed up on a riverbank approximately 2 miles from the cave exit, barely alive, suffering from severe hypothermia and trauma. They found Judy nearby, dead, her body bearing evidence of the cave environment that she had been trying to survive. Philip was found further downstream, and he was still alive when they found him, though he never regained the ability to speak coherently. He died in the hospital 2 weeks later, never having told anyone what had happened to him in those caves. Irene was never found. Victor was never found. Megan was never found. Sean's body was recovered from the cave system by a specialized team, and the medical examiner's report was sealed, which tells me everything I need to know about what they found. The official investigation concluded that a sudden rock collapse had caused a partial flooding of the cave system, and that we had been swept downstream by the resulting flash flood. The rangers who conducted the rescue stated that the cave system was extremely dangerous and should have never been entered by civilians. There was no mention of the bats in any official report. There was no mention of the intelligence displayed by the creatures that inhabited those caves. There was no mention of the fact that they seemed to be hunting us with a purpose and precision that suggested something far more complex than animal instinct. I have not left my house in almost 2 years. I have nightmares every night, and on the rare nights when I actually sleep without nightmares, I wake up in a state of panic that is almost worse than the dreams themselves. I can hear them sometimes, the sound of wings in the darkness, the sound of something intelligent and ancient and hungry moving through the spaces between the walls of my house. I am writing this account because people need to know what is in those caves. People need to understand that there are places in this world that should not be entered, places that are home to things that we do not fully understand and perhaps should never attempt to understand. The Appalachian caves are beautiful, yes, but they are also wrong in a way that is difficult to articulate to anyone who has not been down there, who has not looked into the eyes of something that has learned to hunt intelligent creatures with the efficiency of a machine. If you are considering entering those caves, I urge you to reconsider. Go somewhere else. Take your vacation elsewhere. Leave those caves to the darkness and to the things that dwell in darkness. Because once you go down there, once you see what is down there, you will spend the rest of your life trying to convince yourself that what you experienced was not real, was not possible, was not true. And you will fail. You will fail because you will know, in your heart, in your bones, in every cell of your body, that it was all completely, absolutely true.